The streets of Warsaw were unrecognizable. Once a vibrant city filled with the hum of voices, the clatter of trams, and the scent of fresh bread from bakeries now lay under the crushing weight of silence. It was the silence of occupation, the silence of fear. It was a silence that carried with it the weight of loss, the kind that could not be measured by the absence of sound, but by the absence of a soul. In the heart of the city, the library was no exception to the suffering that had overtaken every corner of Poland. Maria Simonowska stood amidst the ashes of the National Library, her hands trembling as she brushed soot from a torn book. The flames had ravaged the building in a matter of hours, but it was not just the structure that was consumed. Every scrap of paper, every leaf of history had been erased. Pages that had once held the collected wisdom of generations, the work of poets, scientists, philosophers, and playwrights, were reduced to nothing more than burnt fragments. She had watched it all unfold. The Nazi forces had stormed the library as part of their larger strategy to obliterate Polish culture, to erase everything that could remind the people of their identity, their past, and their strength. The fires were meant to make a statement, a brutal assertion of power. They thought that with the destruction of the library, they could sever the ties that bound Poland to its history, to its soul. But Maria could feel it. There was something inside her that would not break. She was no hero, no revolutionary leader, but in that moment, standing among the burning ruins of a place she had loved, she understood the weight of the world had landed on her shoulders. In the silence of the library, with the sound of crackling flames echoing in her ears, she made a decision. She would not let these words die. These books, though burned, had to live on. They could not be forgotten. With trembling fingers, she reached into the charred remains, pulling out a few fragments here and there. Some pages were nearly unrecognizable, their words lost to the inferno, but others still held meaning. They weren't just pieces of paper. They were symbols. Every fragment of knowledge was a rebellion in itself. She wasn't sure what she could do with the remnants, but in her gut, she knew something had to be done. Her eyes darted to the windows, her heart racing. It wasn't just the fire she feared. The Gestapo was notorious for its merciless efficiency, and if they caught her, if they saw what she was trying to do, it would all be over. They had already taken so much from the Polish people: freedom, dignity, hope, but the one thing they couldn't take was the fire of resistance that burned inside every person who refused to bow to tyranny. Maria was one of those people. She couldn't afford to let it die. She stood up, her knees weak beneath her, and surveyed the damage. The smoke hung thick in the air, and the walls of the library were now little more than blackened skeletons of stone. The shelves where books had once rested were now collapsed, the wood broken and charred beyond recognition. But even in the midst of this devastation, a glimmer of hope stirred within her. She wasn't the only one who had been affected by this destruction. Others would be here soon. Students, intellectuals, and resistance fighters who had quietly begun to band together to fight back in whatever way they could. The moment passed quickly. She could already hear the distant rumble of boots on cobblestone, the telltale sign of Nazi soldiers drawing closer to the scene. There was no time to waste. Maria grabbed a few of the surviving books and made her way to a hidden basement under the library, a space few knew existed. It wasn't much, but it was secure for now. The basement smelled of old stone and dust, a far cry from the fragrance of leather-bound books that had once filled the library's upper floors. The shelves down here were filled with the few remnants of Polish literature that had survived the first wave of destruction. She placed the charred pages carefully on a table and began to organize them. The edges were blackened and curled, some completely unreadable, but she didn't care. What mattered now was saving what she could, making sure the world would never forget. Over the next few weeks, Maria's small act of defiance became a quiet mission. Every night after curfew, she would return to the library's ruins. It was always a calculated risk. The Nazi patrols were everywhere, looking for any sign of subversion. Yet every day, the charred remnants of the library called to her. Each piece of history buried in soot and ash whispered that it was worth saving. If she could, even in the smallest way, preserve the knowledge that was being systematically destroyed, then it would be worth the danger. The city seemed to hold its breath as the occupation deepened. Maria spent sleepless nights sorting through the remains, transcribing what could still be read, piecing together knowledge that might otherwise have been lost to time. She wasn't alone for long. Soon, a few trusted students began to join her. Young men and women who had known the value of the books before the fires, who understood that the words contained within these pages were not just words, they were lifelines. As they gathered in the basement, they began copying the transcribed pages into new notebooks. They were no longer just copying text. They were creating a new form of resistance. There was one thing Maria understood better than anyone. In the heart of this chaos, knowledge was power. The Nazis thought they could kill ideas by burning books, but in the smoke, in the ashes, in the very act of censorship, they were igniting something much stronger than they realized. Ideas were fireproof. And as long as the human spirit could resist, as long as there were people like Maria who refused to bend, the library would never truly be destroyed. The small group worked quietly day after day until they had created several underground pamphlets, books, even in the truest sense of the word. These were not merely copies of what had been lost. They were something new. The pamphlets were written with the language of defiance, the language of a people who had been pushed to the edge of extinction but refused to give up on themselves. The words on those pages were a direct challenge to the occupiers. But Maria knew that even in the face of danger, they had to be careful. One wrong move, one misstep, and the entire operation could collapse. Despite the secrecy, there was something in the air now, something that couldn't be ignored. The pamphlets were being circulated among intellectuals and students. The whispers of resistance began to grow louder. Maria never told anyone who she was, never let on that it was she who had started all. But every time she saw one of those pamphlets in someone's hands, she felt the burn of something new. Hope. It was fragile, it was dangerous, but it was real. And as the days wore on, Maria could feel the weight of what they were doing pressing down on her. She had started this mission not as a librarian, but as a witness to a future being destroyed, a witness to the death of history. But she had become something else now. She had become a keeper of the future, and that, for all the fear that gripped her every time she stepped outside, was a future worth fighting for. But as the days turned into weeks, the threat of discovery loomed ever closer. The resistance was growing, but so was the reach of the enemy. And Maria knew that the final pages of this story were yet to be written. Would their rebellion, born from the ashes of burned books, be enough to outlast the darkness they faced? Or would their struggle be forgotten, the ink they bled into the pages of history erased forever by the same fire that had scorched their past? She didn't know, but she did know one thing for certain. As long as there were books, as long as there were people who cared to read them, the fight would continue, even if it was in silence, even if it was in shadows. And the fight, she hoped, would never truly end. The ghetto was a place where the world had been reduced to the most basic elements of survival: hunger, fear, and cold. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the constant hum of tension, and the oppressive weight of the occupying forces who seemed determined to strip away every last ounce of dignity from the people they had trapped within its walls. But in the midst of this darkness, Maria Simonowska and her group of students, people who had once been scholars, writers, thinkers, had managed to create a small but vital spark of resistance. Here, in the basement of an abandoned building in the heart of the ghetto, a small group of intellectuals, teachers, and students gathered. They were not fighting with guns or violence, but with words. Each evening after curfew, when the German patrols had passed by and the night felt like a blanket of death settling over the city, Maria would lead the group into the basement. The smell of ink and paper mingled with the cold air, and the crackling of the typewriter keys became their soundtrack. They had managed to smuggle in typewriters, one of the few tools that could make their resistance feel like something bigger than it was. The sheets of paper they typed on were not merely documents, they were weapons. Each page, each word was a defiant act, a challenge to the system that sought to erase their very existence. It was in this small, dimly lit space that Maria and her team produced some of the most important works of the Polish underground movement. They were creating pamphlets, leaflets, pieces of literature that carried the weight of a revolution. They would gather under the cover of darkness, their hearts racing as they clacked away at the typewriters, fully aware that every keystroke could be their last. The German forces had long since made it clear that resistance would not be tolerated. Any sign of rebellion, no matter how small, was met with swift and brutal punishment. But even in the face of death, they wrote. Maria knew that these pamphlets, these words, had the potential to spark something much larger. Knowledge was their weapon, and in this moment, it was the only weapon they had left. The words they wrote were not simply calls to arms. They were also calls to the heart. They spoke to the human soul, the desire for freedom, the thirst for dignity, and the need to be remembered. They reminded the people of Poland who they were and who they had been before the war had ripped their country apart. It wasn't just the students who came to the basement. People from all over the ghetto had heard of the work being done here. Some came to read what had been written, others to pass on information, still others to learn how they could help. The pamphlets began to circulate quietly throughout Warsaw. It wasn't long before a network of individuals, people from all walks of life, had become part of the resistance. And it was all due to the work being done here, in this small, dark basement, by people who were unwilling to let the memory of their culture, their history, their very identity slip quietly into oblivion. But the stakes were high. The Nazis knew that this kind of intellectual rebellion was dangerous. They had already shown their willingness to use extreme measures to quell dissent. In the ghetto, those who were caught reading illegal material were often sent to concentration camps, and the punishments for spreading seditious ideas were severe. The possibility of discovery was always in the back of Maria's mind, gnawing at her, threatening to pull her from her task. Every step she took, every page she typed was a risk. One night, as Maria was working late, the sound of boots outside the basement door froze her in place. It was a sound that could make the heart stop in an instant. She quickly shut the typewriter off and shoved the half-written pamphlet into the drawer of the wooden desk. The basement was small, with no windows, and the air felt heavy, suffocating. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, she thought she could hear the pounding of boots on her own ribs. The soldiers outside were so close. She heard their muffled voices, the low murmur of German, words she couldn't understand but could feel in her bones. She held her breath, praying that they wouldn't come down here, that they wouldn't find what they were doing. But as quickly as the footsteps had appeared, they faded. The soldiers passed by, never knowing what had been hidden beneath the floorboards of this nondescript building. They never suspected that the greatest threat to the Nazi regime wasn't a group of armed rebels, but a small group of people armed with nothing more than pens, typewriters, and their own determination. Maria exhaled, her body still trembling, and turned back to the desk. The next day, Maria's students arrived to continue their work. They were young, perhaps too young to understand the full weight of what they were doing, but they had seen the horrors of the occupation. They had lived through it. They had lost their homes, their families, their futures. They had nothing left to lose but the belief that something could be salvaged from the wreckage of their world. For them, the underground pamphlets weren't just words. They were a lifeline, a testament to their refusal to be erased. One of the students, a bright young man named Adam, had been particularly passionate about the work. His family had been taken by the Nazis some months before, and now he was alone, except for the words they shared in the basement. He was a writer at heart, and every night he would pour his soul into the pages, his words carrying the weight of his grief and his anger. Maria had watched him change over the weeks, once full of youthful idealism, now hardened by the horrors he had seen. The war had stolen something from him, but the work they were doing in this basement was slowly returning it. Adam had found a purpose in this war that was so much more than survival. It was a purpose tied to something eternal. It was Adam who came to her one evening with an idea, a plan to make their work spread even further. The pamphlets, he explained, had done well in the ghetto, but they needed to reach the rest of Warsaw. They needed to find a way to bring the truth to the people. "I've heard of a printing press," Adam said, his voice low and urgent. "It's not far from here. We could use it to print the pamphlets. We could produce more than we could ever type by hand." Maria listened carefully, knowing that this plan was as dangerous as it was brilliant. Printing presses were a rare commodity in the ghetto, and their use was strictly regulated. If they were caught trying to use one, the consequences would be catastrophic. But she understood the power of Adam's words. She could feel the pulse of hope in his voice, and she knew that if they had a printing press, they could spread their message even farther than they had ever imagined. They gathered a small group, including Adam, to scope out the press. It was a risk, but the urgency of the moment overpowered their fear. If they were to keep the resistance alive, if they were to push back against the oppressive forces that sought to wipe out their culture and history, they had to take risks. In the end, they decided to move forward with the plan, knowing full well that discovery meant death. But fate, as it so often does in times of war, seemed to play cruel tricks. They had no way of knowing that their success in securing the press would be short-lived. By the time they returned to the basement with their prize, they were already too late. The Germans had begun to crack down harder on resistance activity in the ghetto, and the first signs of their surveillance were evident. Their work, as dangerous as it was, had attracted too much attention. One evening, as Maria and the group worked late into the night, the unmistakable sound of boots echoed outside the basement door once again. This time, Maria knew the walls were closing in. She looked at Adam, whose face had drained of color. He knew, just as she did, that this was the end. They had been discovered. The clanging of the door handle was followed by a violent knock. A voice called out, demanding entrance. Maria froze. Every breath felt like a betrayal. In that moment, with the words they had written, the knowledge they had fought to preserve, now possibly lost, Maria understood the true cost of resistance. It wasn't just about survival. It was about ensuring that, even in the darkest hours, the human spirit would not go quietly into the night. What came next would be the true test of their conviction. Would their work be remembered, or would it be erased once again? The fight was far from over. But Maria knew one thing. They had ignited something. And no matter what came, the flame would never be extinguished. The war had ended, and with it came the false promise of a new beginning. The rubble of bombed cities across Europe bore witness to the finality of destruction. But as the victorious Allies marched into Berlin, few understood the true cost of this victory. The banners of triumph were raised, the soldiers cheered, and the world seemed to breathe again after years of darkness. But for Maria Simonowska, the end of the war was not the end of the struggle. The library she had fought so hard to save, the resistance she had quietly nurtured, had faded into the shadows, lost to the fog of history. No medals had been given, no speeches had been made, and yet the blood, the sweat, the words, they had mattered.